In a small Missouri town called Iron Kettle, an elderly woman named Whisper Johnson sits quietly on her porch, her cat curled beside her, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. She's 81 years old, and for the first time, she's ready to share the truth that's been haunting her for 65 years. When Whisper was 16, she made a choice that would change her life forever. She married 2 men, conjoined twins, and for 3 long years she lived as their prisoner. It was a secret she carried like a shadow, buried beneath decades of silence. Back then, Iron Kettle was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, but there were still things people pretended not to see. Whisper had already lived a hard life. Her mother had died when she was just 10, and her father had vanished long before that. She was taken in by a strict woman named Mrs. Hicks, who treated her more like hired help than family. By 16, Whisper knew her time under that roof was running out. One evening, Reverend Morrison came calling with what he called a message from God. The Gable family, he said, was looking for a wife for their sons, Jacob and Elias, conjoined twins who lived in a white house on Mockingbird Hill. The Reverend promised it was all legal and blessed by the church. They were good Christian men, he said, and they could offer a home, security, and money, things Whisper had never had. She didn't have a choice. She was young, poor, and alone. It was a cold November morning when she first met them. Reverend Morrison drove her up the hill, and the closer they got, the quieter she became. The Gable house stood large and lonely at the end of a dirt road, its paint fading, the porch slanting slightly with age. When the door opened, she saw them, Jacob and Elias, 2 men sharing one body, standing side by side as one. Jacob was dark-haired, charming, and talkative. Elias was fair, reserved, and thoughtful. Together they moved with an eerie grace, perfectly in sync. They welcomed her with warm smiles and offered her coffee. Inside, the house was filled with books and the faint smell of lavender soap. It was strange, but it felt safe. For a girl who'd known nothing but struggle, their attention felt like kindness. Over the next few weeks, she returned often. Jacob made her laugh. Elias recited poetry. They told her stories about the tutors who'd taught them, the books they'd read, and the world they rarely saw. They treated her gently, and for a moment she believed she might have found a kind of love. Then came the wedding, a quiet ceremony in their parlor, just the Reverend, the twins, and Whisper. No music, no flowers, just vows that bound her to both men in the eyes of God and the law. At first, life in that big white house felt strange but manageable. Jacob would bring her flowers from the garden. Elias played old hymns on the piano. They talked about building a future, about starting a family, but slowly the tenderness began to twist into something else, and something darker. They started deciding where she could go, what she could do, and who she could talk to. The doors were locked for her safety. The phone stopped working. They told her the world outside was cruel and dangerous, that only they could protect her. And in time, she believed them. Their affection turned possessive. Their love became obsession. They needed her, constantly, endlessly so, until every day blurred into the next. Morning, afternoon, night, again and again. Whisper stopped feeling like a wife and started feeling like a possession. She tried to speak up once. She asked for space. But Jacob's eyes filled with hurt, and Elias reminded her how lucky she was, how no other man would love her the way they did. They said they'd saved her, and now she owed them her devotion. So she stayed quiet. She smiled. She played the part they wanted. By winter, the snow was high and heavy, and Whisper hadn't stepped off the porch in months. She hadn't spoken to another soul besides the twins since the wedding. Even the windows wouldn't open anymore. When she picked up the telephone late one night, it was dead. That's when she knew she wasn't a wife. She was a prisoner. Then spring came, and with it a flicker of hope. Every Thursday, a young man from town delivered groceries. His name was Tom Fletcher, barely 19, with sunburned cheeks and kind eyes. He always waved when he saw her working in the garden, and she always waved back. It was a small thing, but to Whisper, it felt like breathing again. One morning, while the twins sat watching from the porch, Tom mouthed a single word to her: help. She froze. She didn't answer, but her heart began to beat faster than it had in years. After that, Tom started leaving tiny signs. A penny balanced on the porch railing. A wildflower tucked under the grocery receipt. He never said anything out loud. He didn't have to. Whisper understood. Someone knew she existed. Someone saw her. Weeks passed before the first note appeared, hidden in an egg carton. 4 words written in pencil. Are you in danger? She tore it to pieces, but she couldn't erase the truth. Yes, she was in danger. Not just from the men who shared her house, but from the silence that had trapped her. The second note came wrapped around a cucumber. 412 Maple Street. Safe place. Tell me when. She memorized it and burned the paper in the sink.
When was the hardest part?
The brothers never left her alone. Their routine was constant. Morning chores, afternoon reading, evening devotion. There was no moment unguarded. Then one July afternoon, Jacob fell asleep in his chair, weak from the summer heat. Elias sat nearby with a book, half dozing. Whisper was clearing the dishes when she saw them, the keys glinting from Jacob's pocket. 7 of them, more than she'd ever seen before. Her heart pounded as she reached out. But before she could grab them, Elias looked up. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He just said softly that some doors were locked for a reason, that she was safest where she was. Then he held out his hand and she gave the keys back. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she knew exactly what freedom felt like. Its shape, its weight. Even if it was only for a moment. Weeks later, when Tom's truck arrived early, Whisper took her chance. She wrote a note on a scrap of paper. Help me get out. She folded it small, slipped it between the bills in the envelope, and handed it to him with shaking hands. Tom met her eyes, nodded once, and said nothing. Days passed. The truck didn't come back. The twins grew restless, whispering to each other in tones she couldn't make out. Then one Monday morning, engines rumbled up the hill. Tires crunched on gravel. Voices called from outside. Firm, official, commanding. Sheriff Franklin. Tom Fletcher, and Tom's aunt, Martha, who worked at the courthouse. She'd been keeping records. Strange deliveries, unusual payments, missing girls from years before. It wasn't rumor anymore. It was evidence. Inside, Jacob and Elias panicked. Jacob locked the doors. Elias hid food. They told Whisper that the outside world was jealous of their happiness, that people wanted to take her away. Whisper didn't believe it anymore. When the sheriff knocked and demanded entry, the twins argued for the first time in front of her. Elias told Jacob to let her go. Jacob shouted that she was theirs. Elias turned to Whisper. Take the keys, he said. She did. Her hand shook, but she walked to the door and unlocked it herself. The sunlight that poured in was blinding. Sheriff Franklin stepped forward. Ma'am, he said gently, are you here because you want to be? Whisper looked at Jacob, then Elias. Jacob's face was full of rage. Elias was crying. She took a deep breath. No, she said. That one word ended 3 years of captivity, and for the first time since she was 16, Whisper Johnson was free. When the door on Mockingbird Hill opened, the world came rushing back in, sunlight, fresh air, and the sound of voices that didn't belong to fear. Whisper Johnson stepped outside and breathed for the first time in years. Sheriff Franklin led her down the porch steps while Tom Fletcher stood nearby, his hands trembling, his face pale with worry and relief. The air smelled like cut grass and rain. For a moment, Whisper thought she might faint, not from weakness but from the shock of freedom itself. The law handled what came next. The brothers didn't resist when the sheriff entered the house. Jacob raged, Elias wept, but neither of them followed when Whisper climbed into the back of the patrol car. The drive down the hill was silent except for the hum of the engine and the sound of her own heartbeat. Each turn of the wheels carried her further from the years she'd lost, and closer to the person she'd almost forgotten she could be. The investigation stretched on for months. The court struggled to define what had happened. The marriage had been arranged and witnessed, but it wasn't recognized under any real law. She wasn't technically kidnapped, but she hadn't been free either. She existed in a gray space between victim and survivor, where justice moved slowly and mercy had to be built by hand. Martha Fletcher, Tom's aunt, took Whisper into her home. A modest place above the courthouse with creaky floors and the smell of lemon polish, Martha gave her something she hadn't known she needed: quiet stability. There was no preaching, no pity, just a safe room with a small bed and a window that actually opened. For months, Whisper would wake in the night expecting to hear the twins moving in the dark. Her hands would reach for the edges of the bed, half afraid she'd find someone else there. But the only sound was the ticking of a clock and the soft breath of her own freedom. Martha helped her find a job at the courthouse, sorting papers and answering phones. It was simple work, but it gave Whisper something powerful, a routine that belonged to her alone. She started to rebuild her life one document, one small decision, one quiet morning at a time. Tom visited often, though never uninvited. Sometimes he'd bring her peaches from the market or books he thought she'd like. He never asked about the hill or the years she'd spent there. He just made sure she had someone to talk to who didn't need her to explain her silence. The townspeople whispered. Iron Kettle always did. But over time, even the whispers faded. The Gable twins left town under the sheriff's escort. Some said they went north. Others said west. No one really knew, and for the first time Whisper didn't care. Years passed. Slowly, life stopped feeling like recovery and started feeling like living. She learned how to laugh again, softly at first, then freely. She learned how to walk through town without fear of who might be watching. And one autumn afternoon, when Tom asked if she'd like to walk by the river, she said yes. The walk became a habit. Every Sunday, they'd sit on the riverbank and watch the water move. Tom would peel an apple with a pocket knife, slice it into thin pieces, and hand them to her one by one. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. It was never awkward. It was enough just to be there alive together. 3 years after she left Mockingbird Hill, Tom asked her to marry him. He did it simply, without ceremony, under the old courthouse oak. Whisper said yes, not out of fear or obligation, but because she wanted to. They married quietly and built a life that was theirs in every way the first one never had been. They had 2 children. They built a small house at the edge of town with a porch that faced the sunrise. Whisper planted flowers every spring, and every window stayed unlocked. For decades, she rarely spoke of the hill or the brothers. There was no need to. She lived her peace in the open, in laughter, in work, in the ordinary beauty of each day. When Tom passed away after 43 years of marriage, Whisper was 76. His death was gentle, the kind that comes at the end of a long, good life. And though she grieved deeply, she carried no regret. Together they'd built something steady out of broken beginnings. Now at 81, Whisper sits on her porch in that same house, sunlight warming her hands. Her cat sleeps beside her. Her garden sways in the breeze. To anyone passing by, she looks like any other old woman watching the world go by. But inside her, there's a quiet knowing. The kind that only comes from surviving the unthinkable and still finding a way to love the world again. She sometimes thinks of the brothers, Jacob and Elias, not with anger, but with a strange, distant sadness. They were men twisted by their own isolation, shaped by fear and desperation. They wanted to be loved, but they never understood what love really was. Whisper doesn't excuse them, but she also doesn't let them own her story anymore. They took years from her, but they didn't take her life. She reclaimed that. When people ask about her past, she simply smiles and says she's lived many lives, some hard, some blessed. And then she adds, "The best thing I ever learned was that love doesn't need locks and safety doesn't require cages." She says it softly, almost to herself. Because the truth doesn't always need to shout. And if there's one thing she hopes others might learn from her story, it's this. Even the darkest years don't define you forever. There is always a door somewhere, even when you can't see it. There's always a chance to step into the light. And when you do, that first breath of freedom is worth everything you've endured. Whisper Johnson lived the rest of her life quietly, surrounded by her garden, her children, and the soft comfort of an unlocked door. Her story is not just about what she survived, but about the peace she built after the storm. Because survival is only half the journey. The other half is learning to live again, and she did one morning, one breath, one act of courage at a time.